Here we go. Hey, this is Mike. Today is January 2nd, and I'm interviewing my friend Russ Eckel, who is someone from this I met social economy, social policy program at Boston College. Hey, Russ.
Michael, how are you?
Doing all right. So let's start off, Russ. Tell me a bit about your childhood and kind of what led you to be part of, the program at Boston College.
Well, so I'll cover a little bit about my kind of youth, and then maybe in the course of the conversation we might even find some connections between that and social economy. But yeah, I grew up in a town just west of Boston, Arlington, Massachusetts. It was a very nice, it was a wonderful town to grow up in. It bordered Cambridge and Somerville. It was a kind of a working class and middle class community. And when I'm a little kid, we're living in veterans housing in East Arlington. And then 1953, I'm 3 years old. My parents managed to buy their first single family home. At that point in time, they had 3 kids, my oldest sister, Diane, and my twin sister, Carolyn. So I grew up a twin. So that's important, and I think in many ways. 3 more brothers appeared. My brother Bob, and then David, and then finally Richard. So there's 6 siblings, and we're growing up in what is referred to as Arlington Heights. It literally is one of the highest points in the immediate kind of western suburbs from Boston. And still to this day, one of my most wonderful memories. In our neighborhood, there was what had previously been probably 50 years prior, a celery farm. So the farm area was referred to as Robbins Farm, and there's a beautiful hill. We used to go sledding. As a kid, we played baseball and football and basketball and all kinds of things at Robbins Farm. But one of the most wonderful things I remember from my early childhood, sitting at the peak of Robbins Farm Hill, and from that vantage point, you could see the entire cityscape of Boston. You could see the entire city out to the airport. And back then, there was one, we used to think of it as a skyscraper in Boston. It's the old John Hancock building, the iconic building with the weather vane on it. And until the advent and the construction of the Prudential Tower, the old John Hancock building was not only the tallest building in Boston, but I learned as a kid, it was the tallest building between New York City and Montreal. So I used to think this building was just astounding. And I would sit, particularly in the early fall, I'd sit at Robbins Farm and I would watch the lights come on across the Boston skyline. And so when I look back now, I mean, years later, and fairly recently, I lived not in Arlington, but my wife Paula and I lived in a community not far away. And I used to go up to Robbins Farm, and I would sit there. And of course, the skyscraper of Boston now is remarkably transformed. You can barely see the old John Hancock Tower. And I would sit there, and I still, to this day, I didn't, when you're 4, 5, 6 years old, you don't think in these terms. but I was always in awe, really in awe, sitting there sometimes by myself, looking out across, the city of Boston. And to this day, I still think of it as kind of a sacred place. There was something about the energy at that place. I just loved it. So that was kind of the neighborhood. The other thing is, this is the 1950s. Um, Most of the folks who in that neighborhood bought their homes, as my parents did, in that post-war era, from the late 40s into the early and mid 1950s. And most of these families, like my parents, were pretty strong Catholics. So we grew up in one of those classic neighborhoods where within about 10 or 12 homes, there's easily 50 kids, including one family that had 12.
Oh my gosh.
So, I mean, and this was back in the day when, not only were parents not concerned when the little kids were outside. First of all, they knew that we were with 27 other kids. But one of my mother's favorite phrases, particularly during the summertime, was after breakfast, get out of the house, go outside, and we'd get on our bikes and we'd go to the park. So, in this respect, I would say, this is the quintessential post-war, grow up in a neighborhood. Now, it's not an urban neighborhood. We're not on brownstone stoops and that sort of thing. But we're in this community, pretty dense community, lots of kids, and there isn't a day goes by when you're not climbing trees or playing relivio or playing baseball or whatever. So in that respect, I would say, my early childhood was, I'm not going to say idyllic, like every family, my family had their issues, but it was just this wonderful neighborhood that really felt, in the truest sense of the word, like a community. I mean, the adults, it's that classic story. The adults all looked out for everybody. The adults looked out for each other. There was plenty of support as, particularly, the women of the post-war era, are having their families. They're mostly homemakers and full-time, working, doing all the domestic chores. And, I remember one time I was down in the basement where my parents had their laundry room, and we had one of those wringer dryers where you would put the clothes to, and of course me, knucklehead, I stick my hand through the wringer in the wringer washer. That didn't feel very good. Um, and so now it's, we're coming into the early 60s. We moved. Um, we needed a little bit bigger space, but we stayed in Arlington. Oddly enough, where we moved, we literally abutted another wonderful parkland that had a pond that became kind of my home, particularly in the wintertime, because I loved skating. I loved playing hockey.
Huh.
I was a decent athlete, not a great athlete, but I loved playing hockey. I loved being out in the wintertime, on a pond. The town lit the pond at night. The lights would go off at 9. So, even again, at that point, we're on the pond, and not on school nights, but on a weekend, on a Saturday night, I'm at the pond until they turn the lights out at 9 o'clock, skating all day long. I've got my dad's Navy bag was my hockey bag for my skates and that sort of thing. And, you'd throw some tangerines or oranges in the hockey bag and off you'd go to Hills Pond.
Did you often, just a question, did you often play with your siblings then, or?
Oh yeah, yes. It was kind of, yeah, it was very much, now as with all kids and siblings, there are age ranges, right? So, I would say certainly my youngest brother, Richard, who was, 6 years younger than I, um, when I'm 9 years old, 10, 11, 12 years old, he's too young. But yeah, I mean, I'd be playing, ball with my brothers, and that was the case with most of the other families as well. So, that was what was expected. Um, and you didn't exclude anybody, and that was one of the things about growing up, is as a kid you just learn how to make space for other kids, right? um, because it was just what you did. So you made room for whoever new came into the neighborhood. um, the only other thing, and I'm not sure this is all that relevant, at least in a conscious cognitive sense, but as I mentioned, we grew up in a pretty strong Catholic family, went to Catholic grammar schools, went to Catholic high school in Arlington. Um, I was involved in some of the Catholic rituals, that kids were involved with back in the 50s and 60s. Um, and, by the time I'm graduating high school, 1968, um, I'm certainly aware of, Father Daniel Berrigan and the progressive Catholics who were pouring blood on the files in draft boards in, Baltimore, Maryland, or whatever. And that, I liked that, right? There were two things that I think I took from my many years of in my younger days of growing up a Catholic, was a kind of a respect for kind of the liturgy and the ritual, the practice, if you will. Not so much the ideology and the dogma, but I was intrigued by some of the ritual, and you know, I still find some of ritual. I think in a cultural sense, I think is important. Um, and so, other than that, I was not, I was a good student. I was not an exceptional student. I mean, I don't think anybody, you know, would necessarily have assumed that I would go on and, to graduate school and get my doctorate. But I liked school. I think I was always curious. Wasn't the greatest in science. I mean, it was very clear I was not going to be a physicist or an oncologist. I had a very strong interest in politics and such. And in fact, when I went off to college, my major in college was international relations, and I was very interested in that. I enjoyed languages quite a bit, um, but like so many of us, who the baby boomer generation, who kind of came of age in the '60s, you were very aware of the world around you in that sense. So the idea of, when I was in high school, I think in my mind, I might have thought of myself as like working in the State Department or something like that.
Yeah.
Um,
Were
and
your
of course,
parents?
the other thing is, growing up in Boston,
Yeah.
um, my parents were not, you know, ideologues, but they were strong Democrats. My dad grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and his dad was a big Roosevelt guy during the Depression. So, and likewise, my mother, and both my parents lost both their parents, except for my one grandmother, when they were both pretty young. So, the legacy, the psychological legacy, the political legacy of the Great Depression and World War II, were absolutely took center stage in terms of my own parents' biographies. And so, we were a strong Democratic family. And of course, growing up in Boston, 1959, 1960, 61, everybody, was in love with John Kennedy. So we kind of, that whole kind of Kennedy mystique, we were imbued with that. Um, and so I carried that through high school. I was pretty active in high school and in a lot of different things, but um, then I go off to a college where I could major in international relations. And it turns out this was not why I went there, but it was again a Catholic college in Worcester, Massachusetts. And um, and at that point, clearly, I'm the kind of the unraveling, both the intellectual and even the kind of emotional, psychological unraveling that so many people went through in the mid and late 60s into the early 70s. That you wake up one morning and clearly between the war in Vietnam and so many of the other conflicts in the United States beginning in the early 1960s, um, you know, it was we all went through some period of disillusionment followed by activism. And so when I'm in college, um, it didn't take too long before the idea of going to work for the State Department completely dissolved.
Right.
Nothing particularly came to replace it. And because I was too busy going to the anti-war demonstrations and all of that sort of thing. And I
Now
was
you
very
weren't,
active.
so you weren't drafted then.
No, one, and I'll tell you about this in a little bit, but
Okay.
one, my eyesight,
Okay.
even back then was not very good. But number two, I was in the first lottery and my draft number was like 330, something like that. So it was very clear that I think that was 1970 was the first lottery. So, you know, basically what everyone was saying back then is, there's no way you're gonna, get drafted.
Yeah.
So no, I managed to avoid that, and obviously, millions of other people, unfortunately, were
Yeah.
not able to avoid it.
Right.
So,
But you're in,
and so,
it's after college now. And so, I mean, what year is that then?
well, so I should have graduated by the calendar and the clock
Right.
in 1972. I graduated in 73.
Okay.
Took a year off, what would have been my senior year, and worked basically. And nothing spectacular. I went to work for a furniture company that was also a building supply company, and it was in upstate New York. And I was a driver's helper on a truck. And it was, there was nothing to write home about as far as the job goes, but it was a wonderful social experience for me because um, I was instrumental in bringing together a group of the people who worked, and this was not a big company. We're talking about maybe 50, 60, 70 people in total. But we organized a union.
Oh,
And I was on one of the trucks one day with this fellow who he was just absolutely just this most wonderful, wonderful person. His name was Clovis Carey from Ballston Spa, New York. Clovis and I got along famously. And one day we're driving, we're delivering, and we stopped for coffee. And at one point I just said to Clovis, "Hey Clovis, you've worked for this company for quite a while. Um, has anybody ever tried to organize a union here?" And Clovis kind of said, "Well, back in the 50s, some people tried that, but it didn't work out so well." And I said, "Well, what do you think?" So we started talking about it. Long story short, a couple of months later, in the dead of winter, we had called the Teamsters Union, the Teamsters out of Albany, New York, if you can imagine. And we're at Clovis's house. There's probably about 15 people who've come together. The two representatives from the Teamsters Union in Albany drive up to Ballston Spa, New York. It's pouring rain. It's probably, January or February. Clovis lives on a house set way back off the road. He has this long driveway that's full of mud. And these two guys get out of there, each came in their own cars respectively, and they were both dressed in shark skin suits. No lie. They're in shark skin suits. One's driving a Caddy, the other one I think had a Lincoln. But they came in. We were hysterical watching these two guys walk up to Clovis's front door. But again, we heard all about, what we needed to do. And sure enough, we went through the whole process. And everyone loved Clovis and they trusted him. We had to be very careful early on. So I'm just kind of getting this kind of, not indoctrination, but I'm learning a lot about, how you actually form a union in a company, learning about the National Labor Relations Board and all this kind of stuff. So we did, in fact, get the majority of the people at the company to sign the NLRB cards, petitioning the company for an election, and we won the election. And just before I left to go back to school, we helped organize or negotiate the first contract. So that was fun.
But why, Russ? But why did you do this? I mean, you're this young kid, right? I assume the people you're working with are a bit older than you.
They were all, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, why?
It's a good, there were a few things that happened, nothing egregious. By today's standards, these would have been thought of as trivial incidents in a workplace, almost like, why even pay attention?
Yeah.
But I just, I felt and again, these, none of us were poorly treated. I mean, this is not a sweatshop. This is just a nice, it's a family-owned, family-run business, that type of thing. But I just, it felt to me that the people who work there, and this is my first real full-time job, that the people who work there were not treated with the respect that I thought they deserved. So it part of it was economic, and part of it was just, wait a minute, even in this little company of 50, 60 employees, there's a power imbalance here. And I can see almost on a day-to-day basis how that plays out, kind of, phenomenologically, how that plays out in the workplace every day. And I was offended by it at some level. And I had been in one union previously, which is another part of my immediate post-college experience. I did, in fact, during college, have one of the most wonderful jobs that you could imagine. I worked for the Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, Woods Hole Steamship Authority.
Wow.
Out of Woods Hole. So all summer long, for 3 summers, I'm on a steamship. In fact, I worked on one of the last actually functioning steamship ferries that went from Woods Hole to Nantucket, the SS Nobska, all summer long, 1969, 1970, 1971. But to work for the Steamship Authority, you had to both be in the National Maritime Union, the NMU, which I joined, and you had to have your Siemens papers. You had to actually have your merchant Siemens documents. So I got both of those because, everybody had to get them. So I had a little bit of, I'd had a little bit of experience with unions, albeit as a summer seasonal employee.
Yeah.
at the Woods Hole Steamship Authority. And again, I saw that, the union, in my mind, the union was both a good thing ethically and also necessary. So something, and I didn't grow up in a household where there were union members. My dad was a salesperson. So, I didn't grow up hearing about Walter Reuther or people like that. But there was this intuitive sense that I had that unions mattered and that unions were important, particularly in a capitalist economy. So the one time I'm now working full time, and I actually had an opportunity to kind of pose the question, we did. And we organized this little company and everybody got a decent pay raise and whatever. But to me, the most important thing was people had representation, and there were rules now, and the boss could not just be the boss, period, amen, end of story. You know what I mean?
Right. So now you go. Go ahead.
So now I graduated in 1973.
Yeah. Okay.
And as I said, I'm kind of, in my own, my life experience is shifting. And I'm not ready to go off to graduate school. I'm not thinking about any of that. In fact, to be perfectly honest with you, I don't really have career aspirations at all at that point. I'm out of college. Okay, now what? Well, in my wallet, I have my National Maritime Union card, which is still up to date, and I'm still a member of the United States Merchant Marine.
Right.
I went to the local NMU hiring hall in South Boston, and lo and behold, I got a job for the summer on a gasoline tanker.
Oh my gosh.
That sailed a couple of times while I was on it from Portland, Maine to Port Arthur, Texas. It wasn't the most exotic or thing in the world, but there is kind of there's an interesting side story to this, which is also in the spring of 1973, so just before I graduate college, I was diagnosed with a pretty serious eye disease, genetic eye disease. My older sister, Diane, was also diagnosed with it. And because it's genetic, the doctor that diagnosed my sister tested everyone in our family. And it turns out I have this eye condition that's called retinitis pigmentosa. And so a couple of months before I graduate college, an eye doctor says to me, I don't want to be too dramatic here, so to speak, but you need to think about what you can learn to do to support yourself, because you'll be blind before you're 30. So I'm like, okay. So I'm processing that. And in the meantime, I get on a gasoline tanker where I'm on, you work on 4-hour rotations, right? So you're on the 8 to 12 watch, or you're on the 12 to 4 watch, or you're on the, 4 to 8 watch, or the, over this course of 24 hours. So I think on this gasoline tanker that I was working on, I was on the 8 to 12 watch, morning and evening. So I'm standing bow watch on a gasoline tanker. Now, obviously, standing bow watch is not like what it would have been in the 19th or earlier 20th century, because all these ships obviously have radar and all kinds of other things. But the traditions of the Merchant Marine and the rules of the union contract said you still had to have a seaman on the bow signaling when other ships were in range, right? And this was a really old ship, and they literally had a bell, and you rang one bell to port, two bells to starboard. The very first night I'm on this ship, we sail through the New York City shipping lane. So, off of Manhattan, off of Brooklyn. We're in the New York City shipping lanes heading south to, I think we were heading to Wilmington, Delaware or something. So now it's midnight. I'm coming off watch. The second mate was the watch officer. And when you came off watch, one of the things you do is you go up to the bridge of the ship and you make coffee for the officers for the next shift. I walk up there, I'm, hey, how are you? Good evening, sir. How are you? Fine, fine, fine. And he just turns to me and he says, how's your eyesight? And I'm like, oh, my eyesight's fine. Why? Now, one of the conditions of RP is you basically don't have any night vision. So I've never, even as a kid, I had very, very poor night vision. I never drive at night, that type of thing. And I'm saying to the second mate on the ship, I'm saying, oh, my eyesight's fine. I'm going off and making coffee. And I said to him, sir, why do you ask? And he said, well, you missed some ships out there tonight, son. I said, oh, well, I'll do a better job. And he said, just so you know, you missed the Queen, the QE2. We sailed apparently within about 2 miles of the Queen, the largest ship on the ocean on the planet, and I didn't see it.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh.
So that was fun. And then, so that was a few months over the summer. And then it's late summer, 73, I think, maybe, if I have my dates right. I remember sitting in the NMU Union Hall watching the Watergate hearings.
Yeah.
And I think that was July, August 1973. And I'm watching the Watergate hearings. And a job gets posted on the board. And of course, all of this is done by seniority. But it's a Friday later in the day. There was hardly anybody in the hall. So turns out I get another job. And I'm now on a freighter. It's called the Austral Patriot, owned and operated by the Faro Lines out of Brooklyn, New York. And it sails between Brooklyn and Cape Town, South Africa.
Oh my gosh.
So long story again. So for the next almost a year, 10, 11 months, I made 2 trips on the Austral Patriot between the United States, and we stopped at every industrial city in South Africa. Our first port of call was always Cape Town. We went to Port Elizabeth. We went to East London. We went up to Mombasa in Mozambique. We went on to the west coast of Africa, Angola. So I am literally sailing the world on this freighter, having this remarkable experience. And on the second trip, so now it's 4 or 5 months, we're back in Cape Town, and the freighter, has a serious mechanical malfunction. The main engine generator broke. And they literally had to fly in engineers from GE, from General Electric, from Schenectady, New York, with a new generator. So the ship is now essentially staying in Cape Town, South Africa. We were there for probably 3 or 4 weeks before the ship could sail again. So I have this period of time this is now winter, spring 1974. Nelson Mandela is still in prison in the island off of Cape Town. The ship would pass by it every time we came in. And at night, you know, it was Cape Town, South Africa was very strange. This is at a moment when apartheid is really starting to crumble, and that type of thing. But you know, and the country, particularly being in the cities where the ANC was very active, it was strange. But um, I remember finding this one little bar in Cape Town. It opened at midnight and closed at 5 in the morning. It was the only social space in Cape Town that would allow Black and white people to be in the same place. And I went there every night, like at midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning, and I'm sitting there talking to young Afrikaans, and some of them are ANC activists, you know, and I'm talking about what's going on. And then at other times, when the ship would be offloading cargo at night, they used to truck in the workers for the docks from these townships where they were forced to live. And they would, the all exclusively, Black African workers, they're going down into the holes of the ship. They're unloading the cargo, putting them in nets, and they're being dragged up by cranes. Well, I used to go down in the cargo hole and I would talk to the people, you know, about what their lives were like and that type of thing. So, you know, I'm learning a lot. So now I come back, it's 1974, 75. I come back. Um, I went out for just several months to California, Santa Cruz, for a while. I had some friends out there. Um, I remember being in downtown Santa Cruz. Great place. I lived across the street from the Hotel Santa Cruz. And I worked at a leather tannery. So again, I've got another kind of industrial job. And I'm in another union. I'm in the Amalgamated Meat Cutters Union. Um, and I wasn't there long enough to get active in the union, but I was there long enough to, again, I appreciated what the unions were about. But the other thing was I, you know, would sometimes go into Berkeley and that type of thing. And I also learned about, and this is kind of important in terms of the story of social economy. I was introduced to food cooperatives, the Berkeley Food Co-op and some of the other food co-ops. And I, for some reason, I thought this was just the greatest thing since sliced bread. So I left Santa Cruz, came back to Boston, in fact, came back to Arlington. And so now it's 1975. So, you know, I've sailed the seven seas. I'm done with that. Still don't have any strong career aspirations in the traditional sense, and decided that I wanted to start a food co-op in my hometown of Arlington. And so one day I put an ad in the local newspaper, the Arlington Advocate, and I got a room at the town hall. And sure enough, this one night, it was in the summer, must have been the summer of 75, like 50 or 60 people showed up and said they were interested in starting a food co-op. And while I was doing my research, I met a number of the people who had been very active in the food co-op movement in New England. Turns out that New England was a hotbed of food co-ops, particularly the metro Boston area. And the heart of it, the hub of it, was the Boston Food Co-op. So I got to know a number of the people who organized the Boston Food Co-op, eventually the Cambridge Food Co-op. And there's one person in particular who became a very dear friend of mine, one of the most loving people I've ever known. His name is Bill Coghlan. Bill was came out of BU, SDS. The Boston Food Co-op actually started as the Boston University Food Co-op. All these people were living in Alston, Brighton. And Bill was just this remarkable guy. And he and some other people kind of wrote the Bible in the 1970s of the food co-ops, and it was called the Food Co-op Handbook. And I had bought one of the copies of that handbook And I got to know Bill, and then Bill and I just became very close almost immediately. In fact, Bill came out to the initial meeting in Arlington, and Bill was a character. He was as charismatic as the day is long, and he could talk, and he was just fabulous. So again, within a matter of months, we had started a store of, and it was really fascinating because it was right in Arlington Center. Um, on the street level, at the retail level, was the Regent Theater, one of the great old theaters, little independent theater. But down below it was the Regent Bowling Alley, 5,000 square feet, and the bowling alley was closed. Now, as a kid, I used to go bowling there, and not for nothing, but it's across the street from Arlington Catholic High School, where I went to high school. So I wound up being the manager, making the princely sum of $75 a week, learning how to run a food store. One of the great things about it was I had a pickup truck, an old Ford F-150 red pickup truck. So my job every day, first thing, was to go to the New England Produce Center and get the produce. And I loved that, that was a lot of fun. So we opened this food co-op. There were several hundred members. We were then a part of the New England Food Co-op organization, NEFCO. I was on the board of NEFCO for some number of years. So now it's the mid to late 70s, and I'm kind of a food co-op guy, right? Bill Coughlin and I and a few other people in the late 70s started something called the New England Co-op Network. And we got a VISTA grant, and we hired a number of people through the VISTA program to go up into like rural Maine, parts of New Hampshire, to kind of begin to start, pre-order co-ops, because the co-op movement in the 1970s in New England was really strong. And frankly, I was having a ball. I mean, I was just having a great time. I wasn't making a penny, but I was having a wonderful time. I was at that point, I had married a wonderful person, Jennifer, who, needless to say, had a real job that paid the rent. And but I learned a lot about everything from buying and preserving food to running a democratic organization, which is what the food co-ops were, and then helping to start other co-ops around New England. And then I got very active in the initiative in the late 70s to start a national consumer cooperative bank. And that's kind of my connection to social economy directly, because through that work, I heard about the social economy program at BC. Never would have known about it necessarily otherwise, but I heard about it, and I applied as a master's student. So September 1981, I had stopped working at the food co-op, because now I'm going to do this graduate work for a year or two full time, do some things on the side. And my thought at that time was I was going to continue to work more or less in the cooperative business development process. And social economy, I fell in love with Sev Bruin, Paul Bernstein, people like that. So I'm there now. I'm there a year, 2 years, and my story, my path, my work in social economy begins to bend back to the original trajectory, which were the unions. So I'm still a member of the co-ops. I'm still active with NEFCO, but what happened was a couple of us were in the graduate student lounge one day. I think it was in the summer or early fall. And there's a notice on the bulletin board, and it's a competition. It's an academic competition sponsored by General Motors. They've selected 10 sociology departments from around the United States. And then they've invited people to prepare an essay. And the topic of the essay for all of the schools that wanted to participate in this was describe how new technology impacted industrial relations in an industry. Well, what really caught our attention was the fact that the winning team got $10,000.
Right.
Okay. I mean, the the intellectual side of it was also interesting, but what some of us took note of is, and I think the second place was like 7,500, third place out of 10 might have been 5,000. So we're like, okay, we have a shot. Now we're going up against Wisconsin, U of M, UCLA. I mean, there's some serious players here. I think Paul Gray and Charlie Derber, two professors at BC in the social economy program, they agreed to kind of, okay, so we put together a team. There are about 3 or 4 of us, I think. And the industry that we happened to pick was telecommunications. The reason for that is because this was right at the time that microwave communication was coming into its own, and the old AT&T system had been broken up by federal judge orders. So we picked the telecommunications industry, and then we looked at how the breakup of AT&T affected industrial relations, both within AT&T, but also within the entire telecommunications industry. So we did some great research. I mean, we went down, I can remember going down and talking to people at AT&T headquarters outside of New York City. We talked with a number of people at the IBEW unions, and we prepared a paper. And I think we had like 3 or 4 months to do this. And so we wrote a paper on the impact of the legal rulings breaking up AT&T, the new technology being, I think the company was MCI at the time, Microwave Communications Incorporated. So that was the new technology. Well, we submit the paper. Don't you know, we won the contest.
Unbelievable.
We did not believe it, but it was pretty exciting. We got flown out to Detroit, where there was a lunch. So I'm at the world headquarters of General Motors with the team. Paul Gray is with us, and we get our 10,000. And the dean's office and the department voted to actually split the money amongst the students. So they really did. They were wonderful about it. But what happened was this issue of work and technology and what was happening in terms of the structure of the American economy, and in particular, what was happening with unions, I got really interested in that again. So from an intellectual and an activist point of view, my interest is shifting away from cooperative workplaces and that type of thing back towards what's happening with labor unions in America. And within months of that happening, Charlie Derber came to a couple of us one day and said, would we be interested in writing a grant? And it's pretty complicated, but in so many words, the grant was to this tiny federal agency called the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, FIPSE. We called it the FIPSE grant. And it was having something to do with the economy and the shifting and globalization. How that fit in within FIPSE, I never knew, but it didn't matter. So we wrote a grant, and we partnered with the Massachusetts Afl-Cio. The president at the time was a fellow by the name of Arthur Osborne, and he was a pretty good guy. And what we came to them and said is, at that time in Massachusetts, this is now 83, 84, there are a lot of major industrial workplaces in Massachusetts and industries that were really being seriously impacted by the rise of globalization. So for instance, one of them was General Motors had a plant right outside of Boston in Framingham. And what we said was, the theory behind the grant was the traditional system of labor relations in the United States was under severe stress. Unions and unionized companies were increasingly under pressure. And typically the only solutions that were being offered at the time were, the companies just inevitably go out of business, or on the left and within the labor movement, there was a strong push to essentially keep out a lot of the foreign products in particular, and some of the new technologies that were putting pressure on the traditional industrial industries like automotive and steel, for instance. Mm-hmm. And what we said was, well, maybe there's a third way. And we're going to experiment with it at the local level. And so we got a 5-year grant. It was amazing. This was 1983. We got $500,000. And we had a team of graduate students from the social economy program. A number of the grad students were in it. Paul Gray and Charlie were the faculty supervisors. And for instance, as an example, one of our projects was at the General Dynamics shipyard in Quincy. Huge employer on the South Shore, major employer in Eastern Massachusetts. There was the General Electric plant in Lynn. That was another site of ours. There were several of these industrial work sites. The idea was the grad students, we were supposed to go out and start doing research, but the underlying idea was that we would be kind of the neutrals, if you were, that would try to get the local union and local management talking about what could be done to kind of, make these operations, frankly, a bit more competitive. Okay.
Quality circles kind of thing? Or?
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So the idea was that one of the barriers to a kind of transition for traditional American manufacturing and unionized companies would be a transition to a more kind of democratic employee involvement, labor management partnership, right? Breaking down some of both the legal but the cultural barriers that existed in a lot of workplaces between managers and workers, and between union leaders and and managers. This was not a popular idea, particularly amongst the left. This idea of labor management partnerships was seen as kind of really undermining class consciousness, and could potentially really hurt the working class. Our perspective was, by the mid-1980s, the idea that you could keep companies like Toyota and Sony out of the U.S. market, our theory was at that time was that that ship had already sailed, that you weren't going to put that genie back in the bottle. We weren't going to go back to the days where it was Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, right? So, but on the other hand, you could also imagine a day when some of these companies would be, and all these good union jobs would be threatened. So could we begin to bring in some new ideas into the conversation? And that's what we were doing at these workplaces. Well, one of the work sites I was working on was the GM Framingham plant. Turns out that plant was notorious for its adversarial labor relations. you couldn't put the local union representatives and management in a room without checking for guns and knives. I mean, it was, these people just could not. And General Motors at the time was talking openly about closing the plant. Meanwhile, our governor at the time, Michael Dukakis, was trying desperately to work with people in Washington and elsewhere to try to keep the plant open. And we thought that if the union and management could sit down and begin to talk about some of the issues that were quite apparent in this manufacturing plant, that would help contribute towards perhaps General Motors not shutting the place down. Okay, so at that point, it's called the Boston College Afl-Cio Worker Education Program. At the time, I was there was a group of us, we were all a team, grad students and faculty, but I was kind of appointed the co-director along with a full-time person from the Mass Afl-Cio. So this was a lot of work. And in the meantime, I'm still doing all my coursework. And in the meantime, Charlie Derber suggested that I reapply and get into the PhD track, which I did. So now, we're doing this work. I have a few other things I'm doing. In 1984, our first son, Matthew, was born. So my life is pretty full. And my eyesight is starting to fail because that's in the back of my mind too.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Things are moving along. And the same doctor who diagnosed me back in the early 70s got money to start a clinical treatment trial for retinitis pigmentosa. So this is around the same time, and that was pretty intense. So I wound up in 3 of these clinical treatment trials over a period of about 10 years. So that's going on. But anyway, it's now the summer of 1985. So the project at GM at the Framingham plant has been going on for about a year. I'm home with my then 9-month-old son, Matthew, on a hot day in August. And I get a phone call from Charlie Derber, faculty member in the social department at BC. And Charlie says, "Russ, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, Charlie, I'm home doing a little schoolwork and taking care of Matthew." Well, he said, "I just got a phone call. There are some people from Detroit, from General Motors and the UAW, who have flown into town and they would like to meet with us."
Oh my God.
And I was like, "Well, I'd be available tomorrow, Charlie." And he was like, "Well, they're really hoping they could meet with us today." I'm like, "Okay." So I called my twin sister, Carolyn, who was at that time living in South Boston. I asked her if I could drop Matthew off at her house. Luckily, she was home that day. She said, "Sure." So I made it to campus around noontime. And there's 4 or 5 people literally in McGuinn Hall. And we went down for lunch at the faculty lounge that I think was the only place open on campus at that time in August. And they're all in these suits, and it was a brutally hot day. And they proceed to tell us this story about how they are kind of the formative first cadre of people from the union, the International Union, and General Motors Labor Relations, who had been charged with establishing the first General Motors UAW National Training Center. It had been negotiated in the most recent national labor contract. And they said, one of the first programs we want to start is a joint labor management education program, because we think we've got to start talking about what's going on, what's happening to our industry, what's happening to our union. But we want to have people mostly from academia or from the outside, put this program together and then run it for us. And they said, would you be willing to work on this with us? So 8 o'clock in the morning, I'm home in Salem, Massachusetts with my son, Matt, probably preparing for a day in the backyard on the swings or something. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I'm at the faculty lounge at Boston College, and Charlie was there, myself, one other person. I'm not sure if Paul Gray was there or not, but we said, yes, we would love to do it. And one of the fellows then took me aside and said, we're going to need somebody to coordinate this program. Would you like to do it?
Ugh.
And I said, sure. And so now now our own program is still going on. We had a 5-year grant that was, so that work is going to go on until 87, 88.
Right.
And we said, sure. So they appointed somebody from U of M, this wonderful guy, Alex Micklejohn. And he was going to work with us and another team of people. There was not just the people from Boston College. They had people from U of M, a few other schools. And we were charged with putting together a 5-week program. The target audience were local labor leaders and local managers, plus some of the international union leaders. And the idea was it would be the first of its kind labor management education program, the purpose of which was to try to bring in new ideas about how GM and the UAW could begin to seriously address the challenges of global competition. So we wound up actually having a whole week in Boston. So the program came together. The pilot was in September, I think, 1986. The program ran, so 5 weeks. It was condensed down to 4 weeks. One of those weeks was in Boston. Our job was to talk about the economy, new ideas about how the economy could change, as well as changing labor relations. So we put together a team. We had to put together a 40-hour week program. There were some fabulous people. This fellow, Charles Heckscher, at the time was at Harvard Business School. Charles was doing some amazing work. Tom Koken was over at MIT. He and another fellow, Bob McCursey, they turned out to be great guys. They had just written a new book called The New Industrial Relations. And they were also kind of, from an IR point of view, they were really pushing the labor unions and trade groups to think more about the importance of labor management cooperation. We were talking flat out about economic democracy, workplace democracy. The solution to globalization was workplace democracy. So that was the Boston College perspective. So it was that kind of, Sev Bruin social economy perspective. And it turned out it was a very successful program. I had a contract with the UAW General Motors National Training Center for pretty much the next 20 plus years, because we eventually ran the program for them. A couple of years later, so this would have been 1987 maybe,
yeah.
These same folks from the UAW GM National Training Center come back to us and said, we love the program. We're getting the leadership, the people coming through it. They're getting a lot out of it. But particularly the labor leaders are going back to their plants with some of these ideas. And frankly, some of them are getting the, stuffing kicked out of them. And some of them, frankly, honestly, are losing union elections. They're being labeled as, management patsies and that kind of thing, because they're starting to talk about, forms of worker management participation and worker participation at the point of production, literally on the lines.
Yeah.
And so we think what we have to do is run a program like this for everyone who works for General Motors in North America. Do you want to do it? And like we said a couple of years before, we said, yeah, sure, no problem.
Oh my gosh.
So we took this 4-week program, and it was like producing an album. It was like the best of, we took what we thought were the most critical elements of this 4-week program, condensed it into 1 week, because we were about to launch this program eventually in probably at least half of General Motors manufacturing facilities in the United States.
How many
So
people?
we go from running a leadership program that put maybe 300 or 400 people a year through this educational process and this kind of discourse and dialogue and deep conversation process. And now we have this 1-week curriculum, and we're flying all over the United States delivering this 1-week program. I'm still in graduate school. I'm still trying to finish my PhD. And at that point in time, a few of us, some friends of mine from Detroit, a couple of the people from Boston, we decided to start our own consulting company. And we picked one of the absolutely weirdest, dumbest, stupidest names possible. I can remember one night sitting around with a dear friend of mine in the social economy program, who I won't, he will remain nameless. But he was one of my best friends. We're still very close. And somehow we came up with this idea of nomos, Nommos, the Greek term for community. It's like the center of the heart. So we've got this kind of grandiose idea, and in retrospect, Acme Consulting would have been better. But in any case, we start Nomos Consulting, and so now really I'm working full time, running this little consulting business, but doing a lot of the actual education and training work. So I'm flying all over the United States, as are several other friends and colleagues. And then in 1988 or 89, the UAW and Ford came to us. I did a lot of work with the UAW and Ford Motor Company. And then the UAW Chrysler National Training Center asked us to. So, now we go from 1988, 89. I finished my dissertation in the early 90s. And I'm flying all over the United States. And we're dealing with these very serious issues, plant closure. And we're trying to bring in a lot of the creative ideas that were embedded in social economy and workplace democracy. And those ideas evolved into something, for instance, that we called the Enterprise Compact. And we said that basically workers should, for all intents and purposes, have control over the production process and would take responsibility for the quality of the product that was being produced. And management's job was to ensure that the company was financially healthy and that people would still, have a good wage. And that there'd be works councils on the shop floor of these auto factories, and union representation up to and including on the boards of directors. So that's what we were promulgating. At the same time, we're all learning about why it is that Toyotas were, to be perfectly honest with you, better motor vehicles, right? And I won't go into the whole story of the 70s, but we learned a ton about the Toyota production system and lean manufacturing. And the question became, would there be a version of lean production that blended with the idea of workplace democracy and employee participation? And we said, absolutely, there's no question. Now, Toyota did everything possible to keep the UAW out. Toyota didn't believe you could run their lean manufacturing system in a unionized environment. But we worked with a number of plants, including this fabulous plant in Cleveland, Ohio, an engine plant, the Ford Cleveland engine plant. The day I showed up there, it was 1991, 92, something like that. I had been invited to come in and talk with the local union leadership and management. They were trying, the plant didn't have a product. At one time, they had employed 8,000 people. They were down to 300. And the idea was to get the management and the union, the local union, thinking about. So anyway, long story short, out of that comes a modern operating agreement where the union really would take primary responsibility for running the plant. And there was a whole agreement about that. And they would develop what they called the Ford or the Cleveland production system, which was essentially the first real effort to build out in a social technology perspective, the first version of a unionized, Americanized version of the Toyota production system. And because they did that, Ford gave the plant a new product, a brand new engine, their Duratec engine that was going into some of their most popular products, the Taurus, the Sable, and they got awarded that engine product. This is in the early 1990s, $1.2 billion for investment in new technology. They rebuilt this old plant and put together a committee that was called the Committee of 99, 66 workers and 33 engineers and salary people. And the Committee of 99 essentially was put in charge of the entire reconstruction of the plant, up to and including ordering and designing and ordering all of the equipment. So the local UAW local there had 66 members of the Committee of 99. So the union was putting its handprint all over, and a brand new labor agreement that where essentially the teams of workers would run the plant. So it was kind of an American version of the Toyota production system, and it was fabulous. 2 years after the plant opened, the plant won the Shingo Award from the Japanese government for the highest quality product in the world. So within 3 years of a plant being closed, it reopens, and we're running our week-long program in there almost every week because they're bringing people back into the plant. About 3,000 people came back in to work in the new plant, building the new engine. And we're running a 1 week training program for people, again, talking about what this new system and why and how they would have some voice and some say. And so now, now we're working with Ford, Chrysler, General Motors, and then along came the steel industry. I met two people at a conference that I attended. This one fellow, Mike, was the local steelworkers president at Inland Steel Company in East Chicago, Indiana. And his partner, his counterpart, was a fellow named Bill Baylor, who was the vice president of labor relations for Inland Steel. They were starting to talk about how they wanted to try to form some kind of partnership for Inland Steel and the United Steelworkers, again, to address some of the questions of competitiveness, but doing it together as opposed to just management trying to institute new practices or bring in new technology or perhaps eventually just close the place down. So I can remember they asked me, they said, could you do something for us like you're doing for the auto industry? And I said, sure. So this is 1995, 95, 96. And so I went out to Inland Steel, right on the shore of Lake Michigan there, just outside of Chicago. And I spent about 2 or 3 months there because I didn't know a damn thing about how to make steel. So, I'm like, okay, we need to learn about this. I don't know how you make steel. And along the way, I'm talking with workers, particularly, and asking questions because we've been asked to put the entire workforce, about 7,000 people, through one of our kind of quote unquote education and training programs. So I interviewed a whole bunch of people who worked inland steel companies 24 hours a day. You never shut down a steel mill. They run continuously. And I remember being in the blast furnace one night late, and I'm talking with this one fellow, and he's telling me how he's worked there for more than 30 years. And we're having a conversation, and I'm like, what would you like? What would you want to know? Like, what would be helpful? I'm trying to hear from people what their ideas would be for what this program should be about. And this fellow looked me in the eye and said, well, I'll tell you, I've worked at this company for 30 years, and I still don't know how we make our steel. And I kind of was taken aback a little bit. And I'm like, please, sir, say that? What? And he said, well, I don't really understand the steel making process here. I do my job, but I would love to know how we make steel. And of course, I'm thinking to myself, this is nuts. So that one, and so one of the things we did in a program that we later called Heart of Steel, meaning the steel workers, was we went through the whole process of how steel is made and how Inland made its steel. And then we would, get people talking about, well, half the time that doesn't work the way it's supposed to. Well, why not? So this went on for about 2.5, 3 years. And some of the other steel companies out in the Midwest came and asked us to do the same thing. There was one out in Sterling, Illinois, out in Western Illinois. I loved it. Northwestern Steel and Wire. You'd fly into Chicago, and it was about another 3-hour drive out to Sterling, Illinois. So we were bringing these same ideas, right? So that's what I'm doing. And a very important piece that I should not have neglected, 1989, my first wife, Jennifer, and I, we have our second son, Robert. So I'm at that point in time, now I'm a road warrior because there aren't too many weeks when I'm not traveling because we're doing training for Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, lots of steel companies, different unions. And, it's the message is globalization and global competition is, I could see the damage that was being done in communities. There was no doubt about it. I heard it from people every time I walked into a union hall or a training conference room in one of the plants where we would always do our program. And it was very clear what the pain in America was. I remember being in the UAW Union Hall in Youngstown, Ohio, the day Bill Clinton signed the North American Free Trade Agreement. And we're talking about it, and I'm saying this is the dumbest thing imaginable. People are furious. These are union UAW members. Youngstown, Ohio has been devastated at that point. The steel industry was in crisis. And there was a General Motors plant in Lordstown, the infamous Lordstown plant, Lordstown, Ohio. And those jobs were, if those jobs left, as they eventually would, the devastation to these regional economies was, and also the individuals. And I wrote my PhD dissertation about a lot of the people and families and communities that were devastated by plant closures and that type of thing. So, on a pretty much on a day-to-day basis, we're working with people, and what we're basically trying to say is the old system, the old institutionalized system of labor relations in the United States had to change. Um, of course, Wall Street's alternative was just break up all these companies and send this work overseas, or invest in non-union plants in the South, which was happening all over the place. Toyota built a huge plant in Georgetown, Kentucky. Used to be cotton farms. Nissan built a huge plant in Smyrna, Tennessee. BMW, Spartanburg, South Carolina. I could go on and on and on. A lot of the international motor companies were building their manufacturing facilities in the South, in the right to work states. And they were telling the workforce, the reason that Ford and General Motors are going under is because of the UAW. And the UAW tried desperately to organize. They had 3 organizing drives at Smyrna, Tennessee, at the Nissan plant. They lost all 3 of them. So there was something seismic happening in the old 20th century industrial base in the United States. And basically, we were frankly being paid to go into these plants and talk with the union leadership, management, and the workers about, is there another way that we could do this where the union actually could potentially have, frankly, more power, where workers for the first time would have control over the production system, and where steel workers wouldn't have to say that I've worked here for 30 years, but I still don't understand how we make our steel products, right? Like, that's the problem here. And so that's what I did until 2010, when that all kind of imploded. And I had spent 25 years traveling almost 150,000 miles a year to places like Flint, Michigan, and Marysville, Ohio, and Lima, Ohio, and on and on and on. And then I got into adult education, workforce development and adult education. I came home. I got off the road. At that point, I was 60 years old, and I took a job at a technical high school outside of Boston, where I became the director of continuing education.
Unbelievable story. Unbelievable.
And I still have functioning eyesight, in part because of every day I take my vitamin A, which is what the phenomenal scientist, Dr. Elliot Burson at Mass Eye, his treatment trials suggested that at least in some cases, for some people, vitamin A could help preserve eyesight. So by the time I finished my dissertation, I couldn't read a print book, but I read all the time now on my Kindle and my iPad and that kind of thing. So I still have functioning eyesight, and I spent an awful lot of time crisscrossing what is the part of the United States now that so many people are asking questions about. Why did Donald Trump win Ohio? Why did he win Michigan in 2000? And I'm like, I don't want to oversell this or overstate, but I spent the better part of 20 plus years in these communities, and I saw the devastation, but I also saw some of the successes. The Ford Cleveland engine plant was open and is still open to this day, and it's still producing one of the best engines that the Ford Motor Company produces anywhere in the world. There are auto plants in the United States that are still employing thousands of people that might not have been there, but for the fact that the union leadership and management, they were determined to try to keep the plant open. They knew how important these jobs were to the people in the community. They believed in their union, and they were willing to adapt and rethink what workplace democracy was about. And workplace democracy was not necessarily just about kicking management in the ass every chance you got, but it was really about having a lot more control over the production system so that your vehicles, the products that rolled off those assembly lines, were more likely to be products that people would be, more than happy to drive. So that's my social economy story.
Well, that's your life story, isn't it?
It is very much. I mean, this was not a job. And it wasn't even just a business. I met, so much of this was about deep structural change, deep system change. But there wasn't a day that goes by that you don't meet people who are just absolutely I'm still very good friends and very close with particularly some of the UAW people that I met around the country. Many of them now aren't with us anymore, or they've retired, but we try to stay in touch. And I just, and in many ways, I have a very different perspective than some people do who believe that, frankly, the angry white American working class, these people are much, much, much more complex, like all other human beings. And these are a lot of people who, care desperately about their communities, about their families, about the country. And, I just met and worked with so many wonderful people who, what they had in common was they were a member of a labor union. And I still think you can't have economic justice without strong unions. Yeah. It's a prerequisite, and I think you can't explain inequality in America solely on the basis of deunionization. But it is worth noting that in the mid and late 1960s, the city that had the highest per capita income in the United States was not New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, it was Detroit.
Detroit, I was going to say that. Yeah, isn't that
okay?
Right.
Per capita household income.
Yeah.
Because those people, when you had a contract, a 3-year contract, and in it was something called the annual improvement factor. Every year, you got a 3% increase in your wages, plus all your benefits. Well, over a period of several years, or 2 or 3 or 4 contracts, you might have been making $12.50 an hour, but 8 years later, 9 years later, you're making $20 an hour.
Yeah.
So your wages are keeping up. Not only are they keeping up with the cost of living, but you're actually doing a little bit better. So the auto worker, who went to work at a GM plant after the war, in the 1960s and 70s, they have a nice home in Dearborn or, any of the communities around Detroit. They might even have a little hunting lodge up in the UP with some friends, or a little cottage on the Lake Erie out in, Lexington or a place like that. And frankly, some of their sons and some of their daughters went off to Michigan State or Ohio State, right? They were able to, go to college. And, the UAW, I mean, I saw it in a lot of the plants. The racial conflicts were quite evident. But on the other hand, people like Walter Reuther and Irving Bluestone and the leadership of the UAW, they were at the forefront of the civil rights movement. And, I walked into a lot of plants where, Black workers, Chicano workers, white workers, I mean, we're union brothers and sisters, and we support each other. And that was not an absolute social reality, obviously, but you know, I think unions like the UAW, um, you know, did a lot to try to bring, um, you know, certainly income equality. I mean, right? The contract covered everybody,
Right. We,
and
we created a thriving
and
middle class, right?
yeah,
Prosperity. I mean,
yeah,
that's what it was. It made so much sense.
and it was prosperity, and you know, commute, and a lot of the communities now, you know, in the late 60s and into the 1970s, a lot of the car companies, GM, Ford, Chrysler, they began, they built a lot of their parts plants out in the rural parts of the states, rural Ohio, Western Michigan, Western Indiana, um, because, you know, you had the interstate highway system. You didn't need to build a new brake plant or a new electronic fuel injection system plant. You didn't have to build it in Detroit, right? Or Cleveland. And so there was a moment in time, maybe 20, 25 years, when a lot of the otherwise agrarian parts of the Midwest, the upper Midwest particularly, you know, there was a new type of industrial prosperity that showed up in town. Um, it wasn't there nearly as long as it had been in the major cities like, you know, Detroit or Cleveland or Chicago. Um, and I think some of those folks, particularly, you know, for, you know, if there was a, you know, a plant in Dayton, Ohio, you know, Dayton, Ohio became a huge center for GM parts production. Um, a lot of those plants closed, and a lot of those communities were devastated. So it was about community. It was about, you know, the union, the plant, the pride people took in those jobs,
Right.
and you know, too many of them are way too many of them are gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, but yeah, and you know, it started with a paper that a group of grad students wrote in 1982 talking about how new technology impacted industrial relations in the telecommunications industry. And, you know, a FIPSI grant that got some of us out to places like the GM plant in Framingham, Massachusetts. And so there is a kind of, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
there's a kind of almost quantum phenomenon going on here. I can assure you, you know, when I was first going into graduate school, the last thing in the world I ever imagined myself doing was, you know, spending, you know, weeks and months in places, you know, all across the industrial Midwest, from, you know, Kenosha, Wisconsin to Tonawanda in New York, working directly in factories with hourly workers and salary people, talking about a new kind of social contract that was based on a notion of industrial democracy and workplace democracy that would prove to be kind of the new kind of intellectual center of labor relations in the United States, um, toward the goal of, you know, producing good products, um, that were competitive in a global marketplace.
Well,
And
Russ,
I just and so much of this was just learning. I mean, it was, for me, it was like I said, I'll never forget. You know, there I am at the Inland Steel Company in East Chicago, Indiana, and they were thrilling places to be. There was something about it that, to me, it so resonated. You know, at midnight being out, blast furnace number 7 at Inland Steel was the largest blast furnace in North America at one time. And, you know, I used to love to go out there. It'd be midnight. And, you know, you go inside and you watch these people pull slag from the largest blast furnace almost in the world. And you watch how hard people worked, and, you know, the pride they took in the work that they did. And, it was a remarkable opportunity.
Russ, this has been fascinating, just amazing, to think where you started, in Arlington with your mom and dad and your family and everything you've done. You've had a major impact on so many people and families, and incredible, Russ, just incredible.
Yeah.
You should be proud.
Well, I know it's going to sound like a cliche, but it was just such a blessing. To have these opportunities, starting with the people at the social economy program, Sev Bruin, who, was, I, without getting waxing too poetic, I think that Sev had a kind of spirit that, there was a kind of quality of humanness, humanity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And people who intellectually were prepared to, take some risks, and we all supported each other. It was just a fabulous cohort of people at that time, the 1980s at BC,
Yeah.
and that, and then to be able to go out into the world and try to say, okay, how do these ideas have any meaning to steel workers or auto workers
Yeah.
or teachers or whatever, and then to try to think about how to do that in a way that it makes a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I met some wonderful people, and I'm blessed, and um, yeah, so you know go social economy. And look, and these that we're talking now almost 40 years ago, 30 years ago, but
Right.
we all know that, maybe the best days for workplace democracy and social democracy is ahead of us,
Right. That's right.
because we've seen what happens in a world where um, you know blatant competition and racism and classism get to play out on such a grand scale.
Right.
Um, I mean, the sad thing is that particularly, working people in America are far worse off than they were 40 years ago when
Yeah.
we started talking about these ideas.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me personally, most of this is past tense. I'm doing things now, working with some technical high schools in Boston and some other things that I'm doing. But these ideas still have great currency, and I hope some of them will work their way into the policies of the new administration.
There you go. There's always hope.
Indeed.
Thanks again, Russ. This has been wonderful. And thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate giving me the opportunity to reflect a bit on things that I've been honored and privileged to be involved with, like the social economy program at BC.
Absolutely.